Thanks very much for the invitation to talk to you. So yeah, I said I'd talk about the right to the smart city. I'm going to be talking around a whole series of kind of related issues around
in this
kind of
idea.
Sorry, someone else talking there. Sorry. So I'm really going to be talking around notions of kind of citizenship, social justice, rights, equity, democracy, and so on in relation to the smart city. Most of you will be familiar with the smart city. I mean, at a basic level, it's really around kind of managing and governing cities using technologies across a whole series of different domains. So there's a whole suite of different technologies that end up falling under the smart city umbrella, and these are just, I guess, a selection of them. So anything from city operating systems, performance management, urban dashboards, into kind of security and emergency services, so things like control rooms, digital surveillance, predictive policing, coordinated emergency response, into transport with intelligent transport systems, bike share, real-time passenger information, smart parking, logistics, and so on, into energy and smart meters, smart grids, across into environments and sensor networks, down to the level of buildings with building management systems, and into homes, and into the civic domain with various kinds of apps built, and various kinds of civic media, open data, and so on. So quite a broad selection of different types of technologies all being used to kind of manage, govern cities. And that's led into a kind of a discursive argument about the kind of the promise of smart urbanism and cities, and what these technologies can potentially do once they're embedded within governance structures and into the fabric of the economy and our everyday lives. So this is a typical kind of slide setting out the kind of discursive argument as to the promise of smart cities. So in relation to kind of producing a smart economy around innovation, productivity, efficiency, competitiveness, and so on, across into smart environments around sustainability and resilience, into smart mobility around kind of intelligent transport, efficiency, interoperability, smart government, and improving the kind of transparency, accountability, evidence-informed decision-making, better service delivery, into smart living and improving our quality of life, improving safety, security, being able to better manage risk, and into kind of the personal level in terms of enabling people to be more informed, more creative, fostering inclusivity, empowerment, participation, and so on. So that's the kind of the range of discursive arguments that have been driving the smart city agenda. On the counter side are the kind of the critiques of this notion of smart cities, and there's a kind of a reasonably well-developed literature setting out the kind of the perils around some of these technologies and how they're being used and how they're being implemented and deployed. Some of these are kind of more conceptual, some of them are more kind of practical, some of them are political. So the way in which it kind of frames the city as a system of systems rather than a set of places. So it kind of sets out this kind of idea that the city is kind of knowable, rational, steerable in some way, that we can kind of get these data levers that we can kind of pull and steer and control how the city is run, as opposed to it being very kind of complex and full of kind of competing interests, and it's quite a complicated system and so on, and it's very difficult to steer through these kind of technocratic levers. There's quite a strong claim to the tech and the ideas behind it being objective, neutral, non-ideological, as opposed to being thoroughly political in terms of their objectives and the ways in which they work. There's a critique around the ways in which these technologies kind of serve a neoliberal political economy and a kind of corporatization of governance. So this is kind of a marketization, privatization of city services and governance mechanisms through these kinds of technologies. Some critique around the idea of this is a kind of the city as part of the accumulation strategy. So the city is no longer the place where the markets take place. The city itself is a market, and it's kind of facilitating this kind of a new form of entrepreneurial urbanism, which is based around a kind of a tech-driven version of that. So we kind of had that in planning back in the late 80s, early 1990s, then kind of led into creative cities, and now we're into smart cities, and they're all part of a trajectory of kind of entrepreneurial urbanism, which feeds obviously off of that notion of the neoliberal political economy. So this sets up the ways in which we manage cities through a kind of a technocratic form. So this is a very instrumental way of how we address city problems. So it sets up a kind of technological solutionism where technology is seen as the primary means to deal with a set of urban problems and issues, as opposed to other forms of interventions, whether they're policy or political or legal or community development or whatever it might be. And they set up quite rigid ways in which we do this. This is not kind of participatory, it's not kind of interactive and so on. It sets up a particular notion of neoliberal citizenship, and it also shifts governmentality from kind of discipline to control. So it reconfigures the kind of rights, entitlements and so on of citizens and the ways in which they're governed and managed. And I'll talk about that a bit more. The smart city itself, a concept itself, has kind of been critiqued as being quite ahistorical and aspatial, that it kind of sits outside of a kind of a wider understanding and historical understanding of cities. And it treats them as if they're all the same. So I can take this piece of technology, this control room, and I can drop it into any city on the planet and it won't make any difference. So it tends to ignore kind of history, governance, politics, political administration, all of those kinds of things that make cities what they are, as opposed to a system of systems, which is quite an abstract view of the city. Anything that you put software in a network, you basically make hackable. So you potentially make them brittle, and there are kind of security issues here around the data, but security issues around the technology. And it's kind of there's a slight irony around technology that's meant to improve resilience itself has issues around resilience. And there have been a number of examples of bits of city technologies being hacked. The most recent ones really has been a whole series of ransomware attacks on bits of US smart city infrastructure, for example. A whole load of cities, well over 100 cities have been hit for that in the US. It kind of reinforces, a lot of this technology reinforces power relations and inequalities. A lot of it's to do with social and spatial sorting. It's to do with profiling. It's to do, I'll go through some of these as well. And they basically, there's a whole series of kind of profound social, political, ethical effects related to these technologies. So on the one hand, we have all of these promises, and on the other hand, they come with some perils, and really what we're looking for is some kind of balance between those two. So how can we get the benefits while minimizing the pernicious effects, is which often doesn't go on in the debate. People, the debates often you're on one side or the other on this. And so all of those kind of things raise a whole series of questions around, and these are just a subsample of them. So, what are the ethical implications of smart city approaches and systems? How are citizens expected to act and participate in the smart city? How is public space in the urban core framed and regulated? What sorts of publics can be formed and what actions can they take? To what extent are injustices embedded in city systems, infrastructures and services, and in their calculated practices? What systems and structures of inequality are reproduced within smart urbanism? What models of citizenship are enacted? What forms of social justice operate? What are their effects? And ultimately, it comes down to the question of what kind of smart city do we want to create and to live in? Now, that's a normative question. And as I'll illustrate, I don't think enough normative debate goes on around the smart city. We tend to have a very kind of instrumental kind of debate. So this kind of leads on, I guess, towards this kind of ethical approaches onto smart cities, where the conversation has happened in relation to some of these issues. This is where we've ended up, is this notion of kind of ethical approaches to smart cities. And that can come from two sides. So on the one side, it's a kind of a legal, regulatory, technical approach. This is really around meeting obligations and about compliance. And on the other side is a kind of a more normative debate, and a kind of which is drawing on moral philosophy. So this is drawing on ideas around citizenship, social justice, ethics of care, and so on. So the normative debate is really around what should be, as opposed to what has to be. So this is kind of balancing this notion of principles, values, and ethos, and some notion of vision against meeting obligations. And where we put the emphasis makes a difference to how we approach, how we think about the smart city within this kind of ethical frame. And one way of thinking about this is through some of the work that Catherine Donaggio and Laura Klein have done, where they kind of contrast this kind of technical procedural versus a kind of normative ideological. So this isn't from their, I've kind of added a couple of lines to this, but it's from their data feminism book. And they kind of say the way in which we're approaching technology, and this applies to the smart city, has really been to kind of locate the source of the problem in individuals and the technical systems. So if we can deal with how individuals are treated, or if we can fix the individual system, then we'll solve the problem. And they're kind of arguing that we need to shift more to the right-hand side and acknowledge that there's kind of structural power at work here. And rather than focusing on the individual, we kind of focus on society and about redistribution and reconfiguration, what's happening. So they then contrast down the table these kind of different emphases. So ethics as opposed to justice, bias as opposed to oppression, consumer rights versus citizenship, fairness versus equity, regulation of infrastructure spaces versus the commons and the public good, accountability versus collaboration, transparency, reflexivity, and so on. And most of the emphasis of where government and policy has looked at smart cities has been on the left-hand side of this table. Now, they're not against that, and I wouldn't be either. Like, all those things on the left-hand side of the table are good, but it would be very useful to also think through the smart city in terms of what's on the right-hand side of this table, because it brings a kind of a different sensibility, a different ethos, a different set of principles and ideas to how we will think through some of the issues that the smart city raises. And the left-hand side is a very kind of technical, procedural way of doing this, as opposed to a kind of more normative around what kind of smart city we actually want to live in. So kind of the technical procedural concerns are really focused on these kinds of issues. So I think these are the kinds of issues that have been kind of identified as being kind of problematic. So things like surveillance and data surveillance, issues around erosion of privacy, issues around ownership control of the data and data markets, and how the data ends up being monetized in various different ways, the ways in which the data can be used to socially sort, spatially sort populations, to redline populations, the way in which they feed into predictive profiling, and into forms of anticipatory governance, such as predictive policing, the ways in which nudge and behavioral change is used, and questions around, well, what is the nudge, who gets to decide how the nudge works, who is nudged, and so on. Into issues around dynamic pricing, having different opportunities around technologies, but also how pricing structures work, issues around data security, what happens if the data leaks out of the system, and then questions around control creep and ways in which technologies designed for one purpose start to be used for other purposes. So an example of that might be the congestion charge cameras in London, for example, were put in on the basis that they would never be used for ordinary policing or security, but now, of course, are routinely used for those. Another example would be like the smartphone apps around COVID were introduced on the basis that the data would only be used for public health. But for example, in Singapore, their app has recently, the data from their app has recently been used in a murder trial, you know, well beyond what it was originally designed to do. And the kind of the technical procedural ways of trying to address some of those issues typically kind of fall into different strategies. So there could be kind of a market-led approach onto this. So this is kind of industry standards, self-regulation, encouraging companies to think of ethics as competitive advantage. It could be technological, so it could be things like end-to-end encryption, access control, security controls, backups, and so on, or the use of privacy enhancement tools. It could be policy regulatory. You could add legal onto this, so things like fair information practice principles, GDPR, privacy by design, security by design, education and training. Or it could be governance solutions. So these are things around kind of vision, strategy, advisory boards, oversight and delivery, compliance, day-to-day management, and so on. These are all very instrumental, kind of often kind of compliance, regulatory kinds of tools. Now they can be informed by kind of normative ideas, but they do locate all of the kind of the problems in either the individual or the technology, and that's the site of the solution, as opposed to a kind of a more society political kind of reframing and reimagining around what we want some of this technology to do and how it delivers. So just to contrast that with this kind of more normative ideological framing strategy, the argument we kind of make in the opening chapter of The Right to the Smart City is book is around taking some of those kind of technical, procedural, practical kinds of solutions and reframing them and embedding them in a more kind of a holistic approach, which are underpinned by moral philosophy. So drawing on the ideas of the right to the smart city, drawing on ideas related to citizenship, social justice, ethics and care, and kind of thinking through kind of principles, values and ethos that we want, and to frame it within this notion of what kind of smart city do we want to create and live in. So it is kind of taking seriously those technical procedural issues, but it's framing it in a different way. And the right to the, so it's partly around this notion of the rights to the smart city, which is all about rights. It's about reframing the development of the city in relation to the interests of citizens, as opposed to the interests of corporations or states. So it's very much a focus on of serving residents and so on, as opposed to other kinds of interests. So this is the argument of the right to smart city, developed by Henry Lefebvre and then by a whole series of other scholars afterwards, is that space should be shaped according to its inhabitants' needs and not determined predominantly by political and economic elites. So, and it encompasses a whole series of different rights. So the right of habitation, the right of participation and self-determination, and then rights to things like information, free expression, culture, difference, equality, self-management, access to public services, free movement, protect the commons for private ownership, to gather and meet, have political representation, to vote, to be able to protest, and so on and so forth. All rights that have been undermined to relative degrees within all political systems, whether they're authoritarian or whether they're in the Western frame within a more kind of neoliberal capitalist set of relations. Second kind of area is drawing on the ideas of citizenship. So citizenship kind of defines an individual's membership in a polity and their kind of rights, entitlements, duties and responsibilities. And a very strong initial critique of smart cities was that they serve the interests of states and corporations more than they do citizens. And of course, the response to this by corporations and states was to reframe their smart city agendas as being citizen-centric or citizen-focused. To a large degree, though, that was an empty signifier. It was simply a labeling process. There was no actual change in the constitution of the programs themselves. Things were labeled as citizen-centric because citizens used them or they impacted citizens, as opposed to them serving the agenda of citizens or there being any meaningful participation and so on. So citizens were largely framed as kind of in a general way, or in an absent way. In a general way, it typically envisaged that the person in the city was kind of white, middle class, male, blah blah blah, you know, and other people within the city were largely absent, or there was a very narrow group of active, and by that I mean people who took a kind of interest in this, so the kind of people who attended hackathons or you know, open data events and so on, which are a very narrow group of people, and certainly not representative of the wider population. And citizens were kind of framed as being kind of the recipients of stewardship or civic paternalism. So things were done for citizens, or things were decided what was best for citizens by these kind of elites, with very little involvement of citizens in the debate and so on. And the smart cities have rarely been citizen-centric beyond kind of tokenistic ways, or framing citizenship in neoliberal form, which is effectively the citizen as a consumer, and that you basically, you might have some individual autonomy and freedom of choice, but ultimately your access is based on your kind of cultural capital, your ability to be able to pay for the service and so on, rather than it being enshrined in rights and entitlements. Now, this is quite a busy table, but this is basically Einstein's ladder of participation mapped onto smart cities and extended to the right. So Einstein's table was originally these two columns on the left. And all that we did when we were looking at Dublin, so we have a whole series of smart city projects in Dublin on the right-hand side. So this is a table done with Paolo Cardullo. And then we kind of looked at the role that citizens were being asked to play, what kind of happened to them, and then the discourse framing around it. So really citizens were kind of data points. They were a user, they were the product, they were a consumer, they were a resident, they were a recipient. Occasionally there might be a tester or a participant or a proposer, but they were very rarely a co-creator or a leader or a decision maker. They were principally being steered, nudged, and controlled, or they were browsing, consuming, acting. Occasionally they might be in suggesting or feedback, but they were very rarely in kind of leadership, ownership, creation, production, and so on. So down here you've got these kind of discourses of stewardship, technocracy, paternalism. Here it's the kind of capitalism, market, neoliberalism. Here we have civic engagement, but very rarely towards the top of participation, co-creation, kind of deliberative democracy, commons, rights, and so on. And the vast bulk of smart city technology sits in this bottom part, and it's really framed by stewardship and civic paternalism. It's for citizens and decided on behalf of citizens. Another kind of way into thinking about this is around social justice. But social justice basically concerns kind of accepted and acceptable ways in which people are treated and the conditions in which they live. Now, there's a vast literature on social justice and various different types of theories. They typically fall into four domains. There's a distributional, which is about fair share. There's procedural, which is about fair treatment. There's a retributive, which is fair punishment for wrongs. And there's restorative, which is the righting of wrongs. Now, which version of this within each type is adopted makes a fundamental difference to the principles and ethos underpinning smart urbanism within a social justice framework. Now, I often hear people say, I want a just smart city. So I want a smart city that has some notion of justice involved, but I very rarely hear what they mean, what is meant by that. And I think that that's a problem. It's taken at a very commonsensical kind of level, whereas if we were to apply, I don't expect you to read this table. It's a table for me rather than a table for you. But if we were to apply different theories of social justice onto the smart city, we would have very different ideas about what just is. So an egalitarian who's would argue for equal distribution of wealth and power across all members, regardless of ability inheritance, would have a different notion of social justice from a utilitarian, who would be the greatest good for the greatest number, as opposed to a libertarian, which is effectively would have a kind of survival of the fittest kind of notion of, you basically get what you deserve or what you can afford, and that's inherently just. So if I could afford something and you can't, that's your problem. That's not my problem. That's an inherently just relation based on, who notionally deserves it over somebody else. So you could have a smart city that is inherently produces inequalities, and argue that that is a just arrangement if you were a libertarian. You wouldn't if you were egalitarian or utilitarian. And you wouldn't, if you were a Marxist or a feminist or a contractarianism or a commutarianism, you would have a different notion of social justice. And I really don't think that we've had a good debate around what we actually mean by a socially just smart city, and what that would actually look like in practice, depending on what kind of theory of social justice you hold, and how that would map onto what kind of smart city we would want. And then an ethics of care is a kind of a slightly different thing. It's kind of moral action at the kind of personal collective level to aid others. So in contrast to social justice, it's kind of how best to respond, as opposed to what is just or right. So it's kind of responsibilities, obligations, and duties rather than principles, rights, and entitlements, and really comes out of kind of feminist theories around reciprocal and non-reciprocal care. In municipalities, this notion of ethics of care is probably really captured in this notion of stewardship and civic paternalism. And there are big questions around whether this can really work outside of wider kind of social justice debates that actually enshrine rights and entitlements, because there's a very differential on abilities of different communities to be able to practice an ethics of care or to receive an ethics of care. So where we've developed this work the most is in the slow computing book, where we kind of develop this notion of a kind of a digital ethics of care around how some of this kind of technology impacts on temporal and kind of data extraction through tech. Sorry. Okay, so taking all those together, like, using those ideas of the right to the smart city, social justice, citizenship, ethics of care, and so on, can we envisage a kind of a genuinely humanizing smart urbanism? And I'm kind of taking that genuinely humanizing urbanism from David Harvey's work, going right the way back to social justice in the city back in 1972. We kind of need to, my kind of argument is we kind of need to move beyond kind of commonsensical, taken for granted, pragmatic, practical, technical, post-political notions of the smart city. And we need to, at the same time, we need to kind of draw on some of these kind of more normative ideas. At the same time, we kind of need to avoid kind of citizenship washing or ethics washing. So the kind of tactical use of some of these ideas to actually hide real agendas. So that labeling of citizen-centric, for example, was a kind of a citizenship washing. It was a label designed to give an impression while actually something else was going on. Can we kind of reframe, reimagine, remake the smart city within a more kind of emancipatory and empowering framework? And can we draw on some of these ideas to do that? Clearly, it's not an easy task to do because of the the interests of states and corporations and the embedded trajectory of capitalism and neoliberalism. So it's difficult to there will always be opposing forces trying to push to carry on with business as usual or to do something else, but they're probably necessary if we want to try and realize a different kind of smart city. And what would that look like in practice? And are there places already trying to do this where we might draw some inspiration? So there are probably a couple of places that have tried to take an alternative path. Barcelona is probably the best known one at this stage, which very much is trying to draw on the ideas of the right to the city, in that they developed this notion of technological sovereignty, which basically says that the tech that the state uses has to be orientated to and serve local residents, and it has to be owned as a commons. So they've tried to move towards things like all open data, open source infrastructure, open source software underpinning all of the technologies used within the municipality. So moving away from proprietary software. Where they do work with companies, they put into procurement that the data will go back to the state and be owned by the state and can't be monetized by the company, and so on. So they're starting to think through a smart city in a kind of a different type of form, try to get using the technology to enable much more public participation in decision making. So using their platform Decidium, which is very, very well used, like tens of thousands of people are given their opinion on the platform as opposed to a couple of hundred in a town hall meeting. Medellin has a kind of experimented with this idea of social urbanism. So kind of social inclusion in a shared public realm, urban commons for public services and spaces, kind of trying to get some consensus between public and private actors about how the city should be organized, and a commitment that any area where the technology goes in will serve existing residents and won't gentrify and push them out. So that there's a commitment that technology will serve those who are already there. There are questions to what extent some of this moves beyond meaningful rhetoric, and the extent to which some of this stuff has actually happened on the ground, as opposed to within the rhetoric that the state promotes, and so on. And there are questions as to whether they can really kind of counteract the kind of capitalist realism and the institutionalized neoliberalism of smart urbanism. And by that, I really mean that a lot of this stuff is kind of institutionally embedded, and there's a certain kind of path dependency. There's a lot of invested kind of capital through different stakeholders in following a particular kind of trajectory, and so it's quite difficult to move. And so that's an open question as to whether we can actually really shift the idea of the smart city into a different kind of concept or a different kind of space, or whether we can only ever really tinker around the edges and do kind of sticking plaster solutions, and so on. And on that optimistic note, I'll end.